Hey everyone, and welcome to this podcast. We're continuing to explore the significance of Bonhoeffer's religionless Christianity. We're doing that by engaging his letters and papers from prison, and specifically looking at these letters in which he's talking about the meaning of religionless Christianity. Now, again, it's important for us to understand what he means by religion. He differentiates religion from faith. He sees religion as something that is grounded in reason, in abstraction, in ideas. But the problem with religion is too often we kind of trap ourselves within these ideas. We allow the ideas to take over and dominate rather than having this experience of the living God. What Bonhoeffer's concern is that religion turns into an idol. And so he differentiates religion and Christianity, and he's asking questions about what a religionless Christianity might look like following World War II. And so what I want to focus on here today is where he explores this idea of an individualistic salvation. He's opposed to this. And what he's suggesting is that the point of Christianity historically has not been so that I can die and go to heaven or my soul can go to heaven. It's not been about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. It's not been this kind of individualistic thing that we find in current forms of evangelicalism and fundamentalism and so on in the West. That Christianity has always been about what it means to be a human being and a human person. And for Bonhoeffer, to be a human person from a biblical perspective is about relationality, that our identity comes from outside of ourselves, that we are embedded within a community and that our own identity is given to us by being within these relationships. Bonhoeffer goes so far as to go back to the opening chapters of Genesis, and he reads what it means to be made in the image of God and this almost Trinitarian understanding of relationality, that to be in relationship with God and my neighbor and the created world, this is where human life is found. This is what gives us human life, and this is what it means to be fully alive as a created being. Now, for Bonhoeffer, like Augustine and like Luther, they define sin as the curvature of the self in and upon the self. It's like we're stuck. We can't get outside of ourselves. And so when Bonhoeffer uses the term religion, he's saying religion becomes this thing that, again, traps us. Even though we're talking about God, we're singing to God, all of those things, we're stuck. And we're inwardly turned. And what happens in the gospel, what happens in Jesus Christ is God comes and breaks us open. We have to go to the cross. We are crucified with Christ. We have to be broken open so that we can love God and love our neighbor and truly encounter our neighbor. And this is where Bonhoeffer wants to say all of this talk about Christianity is, dying and being taken away from the world and away from creation. That is not the point of Christianity. So on the one hand, we have the fundamentalist perspective that wants to say it's all about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ so that when you die, you go to heaven. Now, what's interesting is you have the progressive side who is really focused on rationality and on ethics, on conscience, and it still becomes individualistic. It still becomes inwardly turned. And there are ways in which on the progressive side that ideology now plays a significant role in kind of bending and forming the religious expression of Christianity. And so Bonhoeffer seems to be wanting to walk between these two things, that Christianity and Christian faith and salvation is not about this own personal thing. It's not about an individual thing, but it's about something much bigger than that. Now, in the last podcast, we talked about Bonhoeffer and Boltman, and we talked about Boltman's language in trying to differentiate between the mythological and the historical and the existential. And while there are places where Bonhoeffer disagrees with Boltman or doesn't believe Boltman goes far enough, or he still remains on the progressive side, what Bonhoeffer sees is that there's things about what Boltman is saying that he agrees with. And so in the mythological category, what you find is the more kind of fundamentalist and conservative, that this otherworldly perspective of what the gospel is all about. And then you get the historical side in which faith becomes trapped within reason and experience and kind of the verification of certain facts. And Boltman is suggesting that both of those are not the living Christ, that the existential question is where the living Christ speaks to us and is freed to speak to us in the preaching of the word. And Bonhoeffer is making that same existential move. Because what's important for Bonhoeffer and what salvation is about for Bonhoeffer is this question: what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to live a life? What does it mean to take responsibility for my own humanity, for the choices that we make? What does it mean to take responsibility for my neighbor and the network of relationships in which my identity is created? This is what Bonhoeffer is wanting us to focus on, this existential encounter and this existential question of what it means to be a human being made in the image of God and transformed into the image of the living Christ through his death and his resurrection. So let me read just a little bit here, and I'll make some commentary, and then we can kind of keep going. But here's what he writes. Hasn't the individualistic question of saving our personal souls almost faded away for most of us? Isn't it our impression that there are really more important things than this question? Perhaps not more important than this matter. So what he's saying there is, look, salvation is important, but we have to define what we mean by salvation. What does it mean to be saved in Jesus? And what he's saying is this individualistic understanding doesn't work anymore. And I think in some sense what he's saying is it never worked because it's never really been the point of what Christianity is about. But certainly more important than the question. I know it sounds outrageous to say that, but after all, isn't it fundamentally biblical? Does the question of saving one's soul even come up in the Old Testament? Isn't God's righteousness and kingdom on earth the center of everything? So what he's saying here is, read the Bible, and you will see that salvation is not this, believe in Jesus Christ so when you die, you can go to heaven. Of course, it's about believing in Jesus Christ and having faith in Jesus Christ. And we can read that in Paul's writings in the book of Acts when Peter is talking about that. But what Bonhoeffer is suggesting is what that meant for them is something entirely different. It's much more communal. We're being recreated into a new humanity. So he goes on, and isn't Romans 3:24 the culmination of the view that God alone is righteous rather than an individualistic doctrine of salvation? What matters is not the beyond, but this world, how it is created and preserved, is given laws, reconciled, and renewed. What is beyond this world is meant in the gospel to be there for this world, not in the anthropocentric sense of liberal, mystical, pietistic, ethical theology, but in the biblical sense of the creation and the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So here we find Bonhoeffer making his, I think, very important claim about salvation. The point of salvation is not to believe in Jesus so when we die, our soul can go so that we can go somewhere else. And I have students who come from traditions and churches that really emphasize this, and they see culture as the enemy. They see the world as the enemy, and that the point of Christianity is to go somewhere else in the end. But he's also saying this isn't about some liberal emphasis upon the rational or the ethical or kind of the pietistic, because in some sense that also leaves the world alone. Like, it's about me and Jesus, and it's I can go and do these other things and engage and be shaped by ideology, but the the idea that God is at work transforming us into a new creature to live in this world is not the focal point. And what I want to emphasize here is that is Bonhoeffer's point, that in Jesus Christ, God has come to transform us, to give us our humanity back, to transform us into the new humanity and the new creatures who are signs of God's love and grace for this world. And that is what Bonhoeffer is saying here. Listen, I am a pastor. I love the church. I love going, I go to church on Sundays and so on. But, one of the things that I keep emphasizing is that our task is not to try to get people to come to church. There are many churches where that's the focal point. Like, how do we get people to come? How do we get people to come? And one of the takeaways, I think, from what Bonhoeffer is saying here is getting people to come to church is not the point. More to the point is the idea that in Jesus Christ, we're called to live as a new humanity that goes out back into the world and exists for the world, to love the world, to be signs of God's love. But it's not about getting them to come to us. It's about us coming to church, doing our thing, but we got to go back out into the world to love our neighbor and to love God. And that this is what religionless Christianity is going to look like for Bonhoeffer. It is about an affirmation of this world. And it's important to see that for Bonhoeffer, Christ is at the center of all of it. And so that when we as Christians want to just kind of stay in our little Christian subcultures or stay in our church, we're on the periphery. God is at the center, Christ is at the center, and we're stuck on the periphery. And what this means is we as a Christian community need to become comfortable out in the world. Again, not trying to get the world back into the church, but to be for the world, to live for the world. This might be, I don't know, this might be a good example or not, but this weekend I was at the Foo Fighters concert in Minneapolis. It was a wonderful show. I mean, it shows my age, but I love the Foo Fighters. And I couldn't help but sit there and think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and think about religionless Christianity, because this was not a Christian event. There was no praying or whatever. Yet, it was a community of people that had gathered together around this thing. And there was people singing, there was hands in the, what was interesting is the nature of it was very religious. There was a back and forth with the crowd. And you see this, I think, when you go out into pop culture and go out into these experiences. So one of the things that I've emphasized in my work is all this talk about young people leaving the faith. I don't think they're leaving faith. I think they're transforming faith. They're leaving institutions like church, and they're going and finding their existential experiences elsewhere. And you can find that in athletic events, in music concerts, in film, in you name it. And for me, there's a part of this that fits with what Bonhoeffer is suggesting. The time is over where the church is going to have this authority, where we're going to call people to come and experience God. It's as if Bonhoeffer is saying is God is already out into the world. There are things happening. And if we want to encounter God, we need to go out into the world, those of us who identify as Christians. And Bonhoeffer seems to be saying the same thing, that this is what religionless Christianity is about. So for me, the idea of unbelievers is not to, I want to use that term positively, because in some sense, what Bonhoeffer is saying and others are saying is we all need a healthy dose of unbelief. that ideologically we get a world pulled over our eyes and we assume this is the way the world is and God is on our side, and our religion is used to prop up these ways of being in the world. And Bonhoeffer comes in with these letters and he's saying, no, there's an existential moment here that obliterates these things, that blows them open, and is saying that we as Christians, those of us who claim to be Christians, to follow Jesus, have to follow Jesus back out into the world. And again, he's not saying there's not a place for going to church on Sunday or whatever day you go to church. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying there isn't a place for liturgy or the sacraments or so on. That's not what he's saying. But what he's saying is we go do those things to be shaped and formed into the new humanity of Jesus Christ so we can go back out into the world and to love the world for its own sake and for the sake of Jesus, but for its own sake, not because we want to convert it or bring it into church, but because God is present and God is there. This is, I think, the heart of religionless Christianity. You know, I say to my students all the time that God has come in Jesus Christ not to take your humanity away from you, but God has come in Jesus Christ to give you your humanity back, to transform us into a people of grace and love so that we can love our neighbors truly in Jesus, so that we can love the world, and so that we can follow Jesus back out into this world, into this wonderful creation that God has made and God preserves, and God is at work transforming.